Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Bent. I'm Assistant Professor of Economics at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm very, very excited about this panel, today's session of this INET YSI event, focusing on these early career day issues overall over the past couple of days and then going forward into tomorrow. Today's session focuses on challenges to teaching in different institutional settings. And to address this, to have a conversation about this topic, very, very grateful and fortunate that we can have Michelle, Juan, and Jean with us. Juan is an assistant professor at the Universidad del Valle, and Jean is at the University of Paris-Saclay as an assistant professor, specifically in economics, Jean? Okay. And Michelle is a lecturer at the Northwest University in South Africa and also an economist. And so today, in keeping in the spirit of this overall event, we'll focus on discussing teaching. If anybody was tuning in this morning, Consolo did a really nice job of setting up this conversation in a way that really hit home with me, just focusing on what I think is a mismatch in incentives in higher education, where there's so much of a focus, understandably on publications, but when I think about my own day-to-day professional life, so much of my time is spent focusing on teaching and how to do a better job of it and find resources to use while teaching and think of creative new ways to share that material with my students and hopefully help them to learn it. And there just aren't enough spaces for us to come together and discuss the teaching side of things. And there are all these online resources and concise summaries of how to navigate the publication game and how to develop research. And that's all very useful, of course, but we really don't have the places where we can come together and discuss teaching. So that's a main motivating force behind this INET Ed project. And along those lines, in addition to that website itself, which is super useful, plan on having these sorts of discussions and then recording them and sharing them as a resource for people who are maybe, halfway through graduate school and looking ahead to potentially becoming teachers of economics themselves in a few years and just wanting to, get a sense of what that looks like. So I'm at a liberal arts college with a big focus on teaching, in addition to research. The American liberal arts college tradition, I'm happy to talk more about that as we go forward, but part of why we tracked down Jean, Juan, and Michelle is to get this diverse international perspective from a very wide range of institutions. And then hopefully there are people tuning in who are at an even wider range of institutions across a wider range of countries. And if you'd like to participate in this conversation, please use the Q&A and chat feature on the side of the screen. And I, as the moderator, will bring those questions in for people as we go forward. And so I shared some questions, pretty general questions about institutional challenges potentially facing early career teachers with these three a few days ago, but I really want this to be a conversation that develops organically, that the audience participates in. So I'll put the initial question out there very, very broadly just to get things going, and then I'm very happy to go in whichever way this develops. But is there anything recently on your mind? We can talk specifically about teaching during COVID, but anything in your classes this term or this semester that can tie back into this broader question of institutional challenges, just to start sort of very locally, if anybody has something they've been facing recently and would like to jump in.
I'm just going to do it and jump in because I feel like as long as one person just willing to do that, then we can get the conversation going. So I thought a little bit about, before this panel, talking a lot about the challenges that there are that exist especially in a South African context. And I think there might be similar challenges for many people joining the session or those that are watching the recording, but maybe some unique challenges. So if I just reflect on what it's been like for the past 2 years teaching completely online in the South African context, I think I have learned in a whole new way the importance of building real and meaningful connection with students, and the difficulty that there can be when that has to now happen online. So something that I might have taken for granted is the ability for students to, on a platform like Zoom or Microsoft Teams that we'll often teach on, that initially I would struggle to get feedback from students verbally. And I thought, maybe this is just very new for them and they're uncertain. We also have a lot of connectivity issues in South Africa, lots of problems. I won't talk too long on it, but lots of problems with students being able to afford data just in the first place and literally having to make decisions between buying data or being able to afford a meal. But what I came to realize is that for a lot of students, the importance of being able to engage via text is so important. Because I would literally call on students and ask them, like, do you maybe have a comment on this, especially if you're taking like a very critical angle to what it is that you're teaching and you want them to develop an informed opinion about something, but to have an opinion and not just see economics as black and white. And students would literally like unmute their mics and be in, the middle of nowhere trying to take public transport to get to an area where there was better connectivity for them to be able to unmute themselves so that they could actually engage with me. Even some of the students that are able to attend university and make use of the computer labs, and they're not, having to stay back at home because they've had to take on additional jobs and additional responsibilities, especially in terms of care work, that even those students that are relatively better off and are able to access the university's computer labs, now you have 300 students all in different classes, but in the same computer lab and not being able to unmute themselves, right? And then talk to you as a lecturer. So really how useful it is to use text to get students to engage and things like just using polls. But then last thing I'll say on this is just the students that are privileged enough to be able to even have access to data to access like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And so it's been a completely new way for me to think about how do I teach via text only, like only via WhatsApp or Telegram, and how do you really build meaningful engagement and critical thinking? And if you're trying to pull off a pluralist curriculum, how do you do that literally via text only? So those are some of the things.
But that's super interesting and sounds very challenging. And sorry to jump in. I just wanted to sort of ask a follow-up just to get more a better picture of what's going on in that particular context, because I'm sure that's something people are facing all around the world. Do you mind, Michelle, just describing for a minute, just like logistically what that looks like? I'm very curious. And again, I think other people find that to be helpful. So do you have Zoom open and are you holding a Zoom class to the best of your ability, but then you also have, let's say, WhatsApp open? And so are some students with data limitations not able to hear the Zoom conversation? Then how are they able to participate via WhatsApp? Like, do you send them, lecture notes beforehand, or how does it work?
So I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief because I could really go into detail because I've thought and rethought and played around and done a lot of things to try to figure out what's the best way to go about it. But so what I will do is if we have 2 contact sessions in a week, make sure that the first contact session happens completely via WhatsApp. And so there I have found for the first time ever colleagues that never cared about a flipped classroom telling me how essential it is to use a flipped classroom. So what the university has done is that it is to access like the e-learning platform. They cover the costs for students to be able to access any material that we'll put on there. So it is in essence free for them and the university covers the cost. So I can put on resources beforehand and then get the students to prepare for class where they will then like have a single question to tell me like what was most interesting about the context of what it was that you were reading about that was your core content for the week. And that'll happen via text. And then when we get to the WhatsApp class, I will have like guided questions on that content to get the students' opinions on things. And there are even some students that aren't able to engage via WhatsApp. So I will download the .txt file, literally put that chat up on the e-learning platform so that the most underprivileged students are literally still able to access that, even if they couldn't join the class live via text. And then what I will do is like leave the debates and the areas for like real contestation for the Zoom classes. But then really encourage the students that are there, and I think we need to be explicit about this, to realize that I may have a class of like 150 students, and maybe 15 to 20 of them will be able to access this via Zoom. So to really emphasize to the students that they serve as proxies for so many students who are unable to join via, via Zoom, and that the types of questions they ask live will literally guide the class in a completely different way than if they were not here. And then we'll do the more, I want to say, like nuanced, in-depth stuff via video. And then upload those recordings of the videos again onto the e-learning platform, where students can then download that in essence for free. And then I send out a last notification to the students saying, like, if there was any questions that you have after having watched the recording, please let me know what they are. And then in the next class, I will literally address the students who could not attend live via Zoom. I will be like, oh, wow, Ntandu, you sent this great question in. Again, trying to like build engagement for students who literally are just not able to join us via live Zoom classes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It was very helpful, and I'm sure that'll be very useful to again, people around the world who are trying to come up with ways of doing this themselves. And so for Juan, that ties back to this, institutional focus here exactly. So Michelle is just describing that online educational platform with the subscription fees paid by university, right? And so institutional support in that sense, but then so much being left up to the instructor in terms of figuring out how to navigate tying in the sort of on the ground reality with limited ability for students to connect remotely with these online resources that are being made available. So what have things been like for the two of you in Colombia and in France in that regard, with trying to navigate teaching during COVID and receiving institutional support or not? Juan.
Sorry, I couldn't find the tool to raise my hand. Well, I can definitely relate to what Michelle was just telling us, because infrastructure-wise, I think that the situation has been pretty much the same here in Colombia. Now, I finished my PhD in the sort of mid 2019, came back to Colombia and began teaching around August of 2019. So I got a little bit of the normal experience regarding teaching, and I only taught the second part of the semester. So I had some ideas of how to sort of prepare my classes, and I pretty much had to get rid of all of that because I couldn't use that for the next semester. So I think that the main challenge was just for myself in particular was not having any idea of how to do this at all. And then discovering very painfully that infrastructure was also a very big limitation for the classes, so that I didn't have as many degrees of freedom to plan stuff. The challenges that we faced were very much the same ones that Michelle was describing. A lot of people don't have good enough access to internet. I was teaching for the first couple of years when I came back. I only just now got my other job a few months ago. I was teaching at a private big university in the capital of the country. But even so, a lot of people didn't have good access to data, for example. Many were, of course, not living here in the city, and they left and went back to their families. So the university did manage to give them, a lot of them, data modems so they could connect for classes. That worked quite well. But even so, many of them just didn't have like a good space to be at when they were taking their classes. So that definitely was a constraint in terms of how comfortable they felt when participating in the classes, how many of them actually turned their cameras on, and how much we could approach sort of a regular class discussion. And I think that the main lesson that I've taken from that was that the class itself could not be sort of the main activity during the class. Sort of in-person discussions could just not be the main thing that we did. I haven't given that as much thought, and I don't think I've done as much of a good job as Michelle has just described us, sort of in making sure that, for example, text-based interactions are recorded and made available. But I think I've tried to approach sort of that in terms of, I guess that the main thing that has changed compared to the idea that I had of how I would teach my classes is that a lot of the work sort of involved in the class is much more geared towards sort of self-paced research and self-paced learning, giving them sort of that type of activities instead of making them prepare for a class where we would discuss stuff and sort of solve questions and things like that. I guess that's one way of doing things that has worked for me, and that I might not have decided to do just yet if I hadn't had to do it because of COVID. But I think it has given me an appreciation for this kind of this way of doing things. I think I do think that when things go back to normal, some of these things I would definitely keep.
Should I jump in? Okay, yeah. So definitely I didn't get the same problems in terms of infrastructure being based in France. Like, at the margin, still some issues, but not to the same extent for sure. And like so I really feel guilty when listening to Michelle. I mean, I'm such a bad teacher, but yeah, I totally agree with Juan that then during COVID, actually teaching was not just delivering your class; it was much beyond that. And then you have to create these interactions, as Michelle said, and so on. And then for me, it was having breaks outside with the students because most of them are living nearby. And when you're teaching small groups, actually, we were able to meet outside, and you can have this kind of Q&A sessions when it's not raining in Paris, so not so often, but you can still have them. And maybe just a thought about teaching in different contexts and so on. So I was teaching both in Brussels and in Paris remotely, and for the second year I'm still doing it. And then I realized that when students are online, they are much more engaged, like weirdly, in my case. And I think it totally depends on the cultural context. And that's something I never imagined before coming back to France. It's that the cultural background of France doesn't teach students to interact. And then when they're online, actually they feel okay because, I don't know, they feel safe. There's a screen and so on and so forth. And so this year I've actually struggled more than last year, weirdly. Because students did super good job as well. And it really made me realize that it was two-sided relationship. So if you don't get student engagement, like you can do whatever you want, even have like quizzes and so on and so forth. If the relationship doesn't work, you're screwed, basically. So basically that's my experience from COVID. You can have some other thoughts, like I don't know, the context in France was basically moving from hybrid format to remote to in-class teaching to hybrid back and forth, like from week to week. And I think this kind of uncertainty didn't help for sure teaching, and you have somehow to take into account. And that's why when you have when you do other things than just teaching in class or delivering your class, then you can keep some stability beyond all these internal changes that students might experience as well.
If I could just quickly jump in, I was wondering if you guys were teaching really young students or somewhat older students, because now that I'm teaching slightly younger students, I do find that it was easier for me to give them sort of stuff for them to work on their own, because they already had made these connections. They had a group of friends because they were third, fourth year students and a couple of times grad students. That's not so easy now that many of them are first, second year students who have pretty much only been doing this kind of work. So they haven't had perhaps the time to build those networks where they might feel comfortable sort of working. That has been a big difference in my experience.
Yes, in my case, it's mostly with undergrads that the connection doesn't materialize somehow. I don't know why, because I mean, I'm trying my best, but what you mentioned probably true. And yeah, COVID didn't help. Maybe you also have some kind of generational differences or something. My sense is also that they are getting information so fast. I'm sounding super old, but compared to when I was a student, like, I don't know, they are super entertained all the time. So you really have to do the best to try to entertain them the same way, because they have their cell phone right there with a lot happening, and you have to make your class like look like their cell phone somehow, for some of them at least. So yeah, I do agree that with age, basically they have a support group, they are a bit more engaged, like within the group, but also with the content and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I taught both undergraduates and postgraduate students. And I would really want to echo the sentiments of not just building meaningful engagement between you and your students, but I've played around a little bit with, and please, I just want to emphasize, I don't have nearly enough answers, and I don't think I've done nearly a good enough job. As a matter of fact, like, I know INET has a very big platform, so I would just want to take this opportunity that if anyone has done any like innovative, interesting text-based teaching, please, I would so love to hear about it, because like the beautiful, wonderful like Kahoot and like Answer Garden and these sorts of things like on Zoom is just not a reality actually in many developing country contexts. So if anyone has played around with that, I'd like attend webinar after webinar asking like, what about text-based stuff? And yeah, I haven't gotten a lot of feedback on that. But just then in terms of building engagement with other students, I've never had more students emailing me than I have had in the past 2 years, telling me about like their mental health issues and sending through like letters from like the campus psychologist. And whether it be undergraduates or postgraduate students, and then trying to think through, and it's so difficult because now we don't want students to physically engage with one another necessarily, so that they're putting themselves at risk, but to think through assessment opportunities where you are encouraging students to build some sort of a network by perhaps doing things like group work, which is easier with smaller classes. I really did struggle with that at undergraduate level. But yes, so important to give the students opportunity to in some way be able to build a community. And so I tried as best I could to like encourage students to create their own like little mini WhatsApp groups and their own study groups, and then like work on that via text.
Yeah, that's all really helpful. Thank you all. And that's, for me, one of the most difficult parts of that is how it's changing over time. So you all alluded or mentioned this explicitly to some degree, but for me, that very first semester where we, went home for spring break and never came back, that was, despite how horrible everything was in the world, in terms of the logistics of running a class, it actually wasn't that bad because we'd already been in a classroom together for half of a normal semester. And so we could just continue on from there, but via Zoom. And yes, engagement did phase out towards the end of the semester, and people had, like, literally had to start attending relatives' funerals and things. I mean, it was a disaster. But in terms of the logistics of the class, that camaraderie, the sort of culture of the classroom could just carry over. But now, the longer this goes on, this pandemic, then we're starting to see, of course, these new cohorts of students who have never been in a college classroom before, and so just don't know what that experience is like, let alone being able to create these smaller support groups. So the longer this goes on, I think the new challenges will continue to arise. Very happy to keep this part of the conversation going, but I'd also, I think, like to kind of back up for a second and get a bigger picture sense, especially with this international representation in this discussion, about these broader institutional challenges to teaching, with, again, connecting it back to these earlier conversations over the past couple of days about how it's just neglected from a professional sense. So I'd be very interested to hear about your experiences while you were working towards your PhDs, when you got your first job and teaching, what portion of your time is spent teaching. How did that differ or align with what you expected when you were studying and researching and working on your dissertation? And wrapped up in all of that, how much, if any, explicit training in how to teach did you get along the way? Because I think, just to paint a general picture here, I think what a lot of people do, right, is do the sort of coursework or master's part of graduate school, move on to the dissertation phase. You're in the library, you're doing research, you're totally caught up in the research side of things. And then after doing that for years in a way that's really very isolated, then being, getting a job, and suddenly a huge amount of your time and effort has to be spent teaching, but nobody's talked about it until that point. They just say, here are your classes for next semester. We're very happy to have you here. Good luck. And so that's a caricature. That's a general story. But I'd be very interested in hearing what your experiences were like. Have you ever received any explicit training in how to teach well? And what was it like when you actually began teaching, and how have things progressed since then?
Should I just jump in again?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So that's such a great question. I would love for the audience members, I hate this, it feels like asymmetry of power, for anyone to please not even just ask questions, but to jump in and share your experiences too, so we have even more voices that are participating in this conversation. So I would say that, very briefly, when I got offered the position at my university, there was a week of training on actual working through the literature to some extent, and actual practical present a class, not specifically focus on your discipline, but how do you teach well? Which I know at a lot of other universities, I just speak in the South African context now, that doesn't even take place. So I was really grateful for that. But I will say that the enthusiasm and my colleagues sometimes call me unnecessarily passionate, that I have with the teaching is very much skills that I picked up because I was part of the university debate team. And so to be able to synthesize information and then present it in a compelling way is definitely not something that you are taught before you stand up there in front of a classroom. My interview was all about what's my 5-year plan? What journals have I published in? Will I publish in? How soon am I planning on starting my PhD? And then also give a 10-minute presentation. Great. So you don't completely bomb in front of having to speak in front of a panel of people, right? And the teaching is just, it's not unique to my institution. I do want to emphasize that. Again, I can't speak on behalf of other country contexts, but in the South African context, I think that there are a lot of parallels with other places. And so then just in terms of the amount of time that one spends on teaching, so I don't know that it's necessarily the best thing to admit this when it's being recorded, but I just feel like there is no journal editor that is emailing me to ask, so why haven't you submitted to the Cambridge Journal of Economics yet? But there are legitimately students in email after email asking me, and so I think the South African situation is very different here. And I don't want to for one moment say that I don't have absolutely brilliant students that I think could compete with literally the best in the world. But in that same classroom, you also sit with students who, my husband also teaches at the same university as what I do, and at second year macroeconomics level is literally teaching them how to multiply out brackets. So now you're teaching math, and you're teaching economics, and you're teaching the ability to be able to, because South Africa has 11 official languages, and for many of my students, they're like fourth or fifth language is English. And now I have students that are asking me, like, would you be willing to help me with just the most basics of basics? Like, I cannot say no to that. And despite the fact that I get told that this is limiting for my career and why don't I have high research outputs, I'm not going to say no to my students. I didn't get into this job to be that person. And so there are times when, depending on like my heavy teaching semester, I'm spending 90% of my time, and that's like Monday to Sunday. I'm just being like so frank. I don't know what working hours look like because I don't know how to not give to my students. And then it's not, and I do want to emphasize this in closing, it's not just that like I am giving to my students. I think that if we're going to ask questions about like critical approaches to pedagogy, then it is about seeing my students as real partners. And the amount that I get to learn from my students is mind-blowing. But then I have to create that environment where they are comfortable enough to be able to teach me, where I'm not just going to do chalk and talk, where we may have, like, I think pedagogies of discomfort and the literature around that was like really helpful for me, which I had to teach myself. Never mind like talking about a pluralist economics curriculum where I had to teach myself a lot of if I want to teach anything pluralist, like I've only been trained in mainstream until I went to the University of London at SOAS. So like all of that is happening. And then I ask myself, like, how am I not supposed to devote actually like 100% of my time to teaching? And I know that that's technically career limiting, but I can't not give that to my students. And so I'm just being like very frank as an early career academic here. I know that I'm limiting my career, but I get so much from my students. I don't know that research can ever be as fulfilling. I may say something very different in like 5 years' time, but that's just me being like really honest.
Should I jump in?
I can.
Oh,
Juan,
go ahead.
Thanks. I was going to say that I can definitely relate to feeling this huge pressure to deliver on my classes and sort of be there for my students. Not just for the stuff related to the class, but maybe stuff closely related to the class, doubts that they had from previous material that they should have worked through, but maybe didn't quite get a hold of. And also occasionally some more personal stuff, which I think it's fine. I think it's good that students know that they can sort of count on me, or that they can tell me and I can sort of point them perhaps in the right direction, because the university has some resources specific for more complicated issues. But I do think that it's important sort of to be there for students. That was a big surprise for me because I didn't expect to have teaching occupy that much space in my head. Sort of, I thought that it would be, just a couple hours a week from classes. When I first got here, or when I first moved back to Colombia, I was in a postdoc position. So my main goal was just to research, and I had only one course per semester. It was very, I had a lot of time, but still that class crept into all of my sort of space in my head. And I ended up spending a lot of time. And specifically, once we moved to online classes, it became even more work than it was before. I do feel sort of, I can relate to that fulfilling sense that Michelle was talking about, but it does worry me that maybe I'm over preparing for classes, maybe I'm doing too much. And it was also stressful because it was the first time that I was teaching those classes. And at some points, it felt like I was preparing for sort of weekly exams on specific topics that I had to sort of really be able to teach. So that was stressing on because of that. I didn't get a lot of teaching experience when I was doing my PhD. So I was trained in France, and we do have. So I'm not actually sure if it's the same all over France, but at least where I was in Lille, if you had a PhD contract, sort of you're paid by the government to study. In Lille, teaching was not mandatory, so that if you wanted to, you would get a little bit more money and you could teach. You would be a teaching assistant. You wouldn't be responsible for a whole class, but you could teach. And I did do it a couple of semesters, but I didn't do it throughout my whole throughout the whole time that I was doing my PhD. So I did get some experience, but I was never really. It was never up to me to figure out how to best teach a whole course. Sort of the full responsibility was never on my hands, and that was a big change. And it was a bit scary at first. I perhaps overestimated the consequences of me just having a bad day and teaching a bad class, but I was really stressed about that. I think that it would have been nice if I had had a bit more guidance on that regard. I know that there were resources, and I definitely became aware of those resources in both of my universities where I've worked in these past couple of years. They had resources for new teachers. They had a lot of resources, in particular after we went online, about sort of setting up an online class and all of that. And now that I just got my new job, it's a permanent position. They are making me complete a certificate in higher education. It's mandatory for all incoming professors. It's definitely, it does feel like it's taking up even more time of that small amount of time that I had for research. But I think it's overall a good idea. So I wish I've done that before. I know that some of my friends in the UK and the US got teaching certificates when they were still doing the PhDs. I wish I had done that definitely while I was doing my PhD.
Okay, so in my case, I was teaching a bit during my PhD, but yeah, definitely not a lot. But I was super grateful to my PhD supervisors, and they really proposed me to also teach with them. So entire classrooms and take a bit of responsibility. So it was a win-win for sure. But at least I was feeling more comfortable with teaching after that. Then when I arrived in France, actually you have a reduced teaching loads for 2 years to get training to teach. So basically, I'm still taking these trainings, which is super good because as Juan said, it's okay, first reaction is a bit like, oh, I'm losing time. But then actually losing time sometimes is super good because you can start and sit back and reflect on your practices or even the equilibrium between research and teaching, because we have asked these questions and so on. So, I mean, the content was super interesting, but just to take 2 hours to sit back was also super good. And so also how I manage the equilibrium between research and teaching. So again, I'm a bit ashamed, but I don't feel this sense of duty you guys mentioned. And I'm really trying to discipline myself, so maybe it doesn't work always. So what I'm trying to think when I receive like all these emails and so on is really to get this, okay, answering will be like super short-term bonus. So I'm doing my job short-term, And I'm trying to see like long-term utility boost in a sense. I'm thinking about research. Like basically, that's also so that was an issue mentioned in some institutions. Like PhD students are spending a lot of time teaching or like working on teaching duties because it's immediate boost. I mean, you get emails, you get like gratitude in a minute. So that's great. I mean, if you're a super teacher, you can be happy every day. If you're a super good researcher, you can get happy maybe once a year when you get one publication. Or if you're super productive, you can get more. But I mean, it won't be every day. And you will get these rejections, which are a pain. So yeah, that's the challenge. And so to overcome that, basically I've put all my teaching in one term. So it's this term, so I'm a bit tired now because we're getting toward the end of the term. And then, so I'm doing extra hours, blah, blah. But then this term is full teaching, but I'm quite sure the next one will be almost full research. So it might be madness. I think it's a bit madness, but that's the way I'm having to keep track of my assessment of this like immediate gratitude versus like more long term, because I don't have like a lot of emails and so on coming in spring term. So I'm sure that I won't be tempted to spend all my day preparing for class or whatsoever. I don't have any. So I will prepare for my papers. And yeah, I mean, it's personal way to deal with that. I'm pretty sure you guys may come with better ways. And when you think of this, okay, I have to think long term a bit, we can think of other ways to decrease a bit the investment in teaching as well.
Thank you all very, very much. And that's a great sort of segue, showing up on in the chat here from Zenzi, this conversation around juggling, teaching and research. And so what you just described, Jean, that sounds fantastic. I wish I had the flexibility to kind of compartmentalize my life professionally like that, because just for personally the way my mind works, I'm just so all in. So when I'm doing something, I do it intensely. And for me to be productive with research, I really find that I need that. I need those longer periods of time where I don't have a million, emails or just teaching considerations in order to make real progress with it. And so, it's the standard way of approaching that for people teaching in liberal arts colleges is it's, of course, it's just the details are different for everybody, but to try to find carve out little, hopefully sort of systematic chunks of time through the semester around teaching. So maybe first thing when you get to the office every morning, set aside a little bit of time to do some research related tasks, even if it's just, keeping up with the literature, finding that new data set. And then during the breaks, these longer periods, especially the summer, being able to actually take the analysis and the writing to their next steps. But by this time of the semester, and things just pile up, and it's hard. It's really hard to manage. And to address this question in the chat, I'd be very interested if people feel comfortable saying, I guess we just heard from Michelle, but more now from Michelle and Juan, about whether, just like what that looks like for you. Do you have periods of the year where you say, I am going to focus 100% on teaching now, and then I won't let myself feel guilty every day, which is a waste of time. I spend expend a lot of emotional energy feeling guilty for the research that I'm not doing, but realistically can't be doing it as much as I should be. So it's this trade-off. So I think something that could be helpful for people, maybe if it's their first year of the full-time position, or if they're in graduate school and trying to get a sense of what the reality of different kinds of academic jobs look like. I think it could be helpful if people wanted to share their experiences with how you balance that trade-off or not, just in your own life. And of course, I think it's important to acknowledge that it looks different for everyone, because I don't know about you guys, but sometimes you see these things that come out from different organizations and different, advice from like literal Nobel Prize winners, and they're like, oh, well, just get up at 3 a.m. You can work on your papers from 3 a.m. until 10 a.m. and then you can answer student emails all afternoon. And it's like, I just physically can't do that. So I don't think that's realistic advice for me. But if anybody wants to share, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, or how you try to manage this, I think that'd be really helpful to have an honest conversation about it.
I'm kind of just going in order again, Jean, but just interrupt at any point if you want. I think the other point that Zenzi is making, I would love to also hear, I would love to learn in this session too. So Zenzi, if you wanted to kind of maybe post in the chat about ways that maybe you've tried to do this. So I think to John's point, I will try for the first time next year that I've organized this and much debate with my institution that I'm going to have a crazy heavy teaching load in the second semester, but I will have for the first time ever a no teaching semester in the first semester. So I'm going to see how that is going to go, because I very much so echo your sentiments, Peter, about if I'm in it, I'm in it. I want to prep for class and I want to do reflection questions and I want to update my syllabus and I want to go even more critical than what I have, and I want to teach the mainstream but do that critically, and I want to teach a pluralist curriculum, and then I want to ask questions about what does it even mean to decolonize a curriculum. I want to do all of that. So I think that depending on the type of person that you are, being able to really negotiate in your institutional setting with what it is that you feel you need. And so I will say, having thought about this a lot and spoken to a lot of colleagues, this idea about guilt, I think, at least for me, has been really important. That I had a colleague say to me, you working on your research is not a betrayal to your students. And that hit me actually quite hard, because I didn't realize that I even felt that way, that if I'm not spending as much time as what I possibly have on my students who I feel right now need me more, maybe this is part of the the gratification that John is talking about, to realize that within the confines of the rules of the game, which is that you have to get publications. And also we could, I want to say, almost just become primary school or high school teachers, right? If we only wanted to teach. So there is that part of our identity that is really fascinated by and interested in and wants to contribute to research. So I think for me, it has been saying yes, I will carve out time either each day or sometimes this whole week is just not going to be realistic because I'm introducing new content. So no, I won't be able to. But next week, 2 out of the 5 days, I'll be able to. I don't want to encourage unhealthy working habits and be well, you can just do your research on the weekend and then you can just do teaching Monday to Friday, which has been a bad, wrong thing that I've done. And one shouldn't be pushing yourself that hard, right? But I think then to be very clear about, for me at least, not feeling doing research is a betrayal to my students, because I also become a better lecturer when I do that. And being in a position of power where you have this title behind you and these publications behind you and all of the research grants that come because of this, I think long-term puts you, hopefully, this is early career researchers, right? But puts you in a better position to be able to say with authority, this is what I think is important in our classrooms. This is what's important in our economics curriculum. And if you continue to just be the enthusiastic teacher and you don't have the full weight of the research, the publications behind you, it's maybe a longer term game, but I think it's about thinking about it that way. But really, just at least for me, it's been about emphasizing that this is not a betrayal to my students. I can become a better lecturer for them if I also make time for my research.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with most of what Michelle has just said. In my case, I think that it's been really about knowing exactly what's expected of me. When I was, so this past 2 years, I was a postdoc. So what was expected of me was mainly to finish the research I was doing and publish. And on the side, I was responsible for a couple of classes. So I was, of course, expected to be a good enough teacher, but it wasn't going to make a huge difference for me, because I was not going to have a permanent position at that university. So it was very clear that I was going to stay there for a couple of years, and that was it. Sort of I wanted to do a good job, and I was expected to do a good job teaching-wise, but it wasn't crucial for me. So it wasn't going to make a difference on my tenure review, for example. Now that I'm at another institution at a permanent job, teaching will be taken into account when I'm reviewed for tenure. Now, it's important to know that teaching will matter, because sort of it helps me feel, sort of it makes me understand that it makes sense to put work into being a better teacher, because it will count towards me sort of getting tenure. I think that's important, sort of understanding that it matters. I know that it's not the same for all universities. Some universities really don't care if you're a good teacher or a bad teacher, as long as you do good research. But for those institutions where teaching matters, I think it's important to take that into account, so that you feel less guilty. Either way, if you're perhaps putting too much time in preparing for your classes, or if you're not putting enough time, I think it's good to know that that work will be taken into account. Now, in terms of juggling research and teaching, I think that I haven't quite found a solution for that. I'm still quite literally just juggling those two things. I was never particularly organized with my time doing my PhD. So I was always working weekends and then taking a break on Wednesday and Thursday, just because I could. I sometimes would still do that, but I found that having to both teach and research at the same time sort of helps me be a bit more productive on both, so that having this pressure to do my research makes me really be a little bit more careful with the time that I might be wasting in some form or another when I'm supposed to be preparing my classes, so that I know that I have to do this right now, because I won't have time later to prepare for this. Now, that said, teaching does have sort of the first priority, because I am meeting students every week, so that I have to do this. I'm meeting my colleagues once a month, so that I have a little bit more leeway in that regard. But I do feel that having to prepare my classes makes me a little bit more productive on my research time, and having to do research makes me a little bit more productive when I'm preparing for my classes. So I do like that balance, having to do both things at the same time. I think for me, at least, is better than focusing just on one for an extended period of time. I did that for the last year of my dissertation, and I don't think that I was that much productive during that last year. So yeah, that's sort of been the answer that I've found so far.
I totally agree with the complementarities between teaching and research. I mean, if you're not teaching, you're basically not meeting normal humans in your job. Which no, but it might be a limit at some point. And if you're doing only teaching at some point, as Michel said, you may be limited in your intellectual inputs at some point later in your career or whatsoever, or you can just become a high school teacher. So definitely agree. And concerning advice, I'm very not at ease with pieces of advice, because as Juan just mentioned, it doesn't have the same way to cope with things than I do or Peter does. And so, for example, it's job market season, and I really like job market season because for all these pieces of advice, if you go on Twitter, and I will be totally politically incorrect, So you can see tons of people telling you how to do stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, they are not in your institutions. They don't know your CV because they're just spreading pieces of advice. They don't know your personality and your what you like to do. And I think that's something when answering all the questions in general about research, teaching, and so on, we should all take into account. So knowing if you're more teaching oriented or research oriented, the way you like to teach, and so on and so forth. And we're really not good at thinking about ourselves. And we have all these pressures coming from students, coming from colleagues, coming from the institutions, and so on and so forth. And we never actually, or I don't know a lot of colleagues doing so at least, we never really think, how can I cope with all this pressure coming from everywhere the best way for my well-being, in a sense. And so in my case, one really good resource to do so was my colleagues, because they are in the same institutions, they know all the information. They also know the requirements to get tenure, for example, or just to fit, in a sense. And to me, you can really gain some time having this information coming from your colleagues and somehow getting advice from them, because they are not, at least in my case, they are super good, but not Nobel Prizes. And I don't think all of them wake up at 3 a.m. So some may still, because some are special. But I mean, they're just human beings, and they are here to share. And I mean, when you sit back and think about, okay, I get this information from colleagues, that's the institutional setting, so my university wants me to do so, they will help me to get these things done while respecting my own well-being. And that might be a way to proceed.
Again, with the perfect segue from Jean. Thank you. Yeah, how do we proceed? That's a good question. One tiny thing I'll just want to contribute to the conversation, because I reread this recently, and I do think it's a useful piece of advice, and it might not pop into everybody's heads when they're starting a new position, but that just building on this conversation of finding ways that teaching and research can complement one another. Teaching classes that very closely align with your research field can help, even if you have a very heavy teaching load, because then what you're reading for one part of your professional life connects to the other one. So maybe you spend the morning, reading some papers for a research paper you're about to begin, and then that takes up becomes half of your lecture in the afternoon. So that sort of thing, that kind of double counting across those two parts of our responsibilities can make a big difference, I think, even if you have a heavy teaching load. But with just a minute to go, what do you have any sort of like, let's not say advice, but let's say like more utopian, just switching around of incentives so that teaching is more highly valued and recognized in an explicit way, incentivized in our professional career development, or additional training you would like to see in graduate school. So when we get those publications, Michelle, that you mentioned, we get that sort of reputational weight and become maybe more influential in how these programs are run in the future. How could things be done differently in a way that teaching is recognized more?
Yeah, I don't know that that's ever going to happen. So I think it's just like internally deciding, like, why did you get into this game in the first place? But what I will say again, like not necessarily advice, but then in this same line, very briefly, greater collaboration in a way where you're just like, whether it be a Twitter thread and just, I'm genuinely looking for this article. Like, I am not actually trained in political science. I want to know, like, where do I start in figuring out what should my students know within the realm of political science? And I don't have 5 degrees in it. Like, just asking, whether it be your colleagues, whether it be on Twitter, whether it be using the types of platforms that we're talking about that INET has, just like being unafraid to just ask and say, like, I can't do this on my own, but lecturers all across the world that are all struggling with this, and those that are particularly passionate about teaching, like share your syllabus, tweet about the interesting resources that you find. Just be willing to ask and don't be afraid. Ask your students. I do this with my students. I'm like, we're going to choose a topic and you get to choose a topic for the week. Whatever that topic may be, you gather the resources and each of you is going to teach for 5 minutes. Teach me stuff. So just greater collaboration between institutions, between lecturers, between students.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I also agree with what Juan was just saying, that colleagues are a huge resource for new professors. I think that I benefited a lot from the experience that my colleagues had gathered. And I was also very lucky in sharing this course that I was teaching when I was a postdoc with another professor, so that he had some experience about the course itself and could really was really useful for planning and stuff. And we could change things up each semester because we didn't have to build from scratch. So that was very useful. And I think that perhaps this is more general advice, and it's really very general. And I think that's the way that I have sort of interiorized it, is that it's definitely a long race teaching. Well, it's not really a race, but it's a long effort, and it's okay if you don't really get it the first time, because you will have another chance next semester, right? So it's more of an iterative process. And I think that I've slowly really understood that, and that has helped me, even if I still take some risks and try to include some stuff, knowing that I can always do better, and I can, if this doesn't work, it's okay, because I can try something else next semester. That, I think, has helped me feel less stressed, and just overall made it easier to plan my teaching, because I know that I have another chance next semester.
Should I find another segue or? No, yeah, maybe for teaching to be more important, just we have to acknowledge that we're all specific and all have different personalities. We're just being very good students in life. That's how we got into PhD and so on. And so we want to perform like in research, in everything. And teaching is not valued. But if at some point we're not just basing our actions on rankings and all this stuff, then you start to think, okay, what do I like? And I mean, teaching is super valuable. And I mean, I enjoy it a lot. And then if you think, okay, that's actually my personality is kind of teaching oriented, then you don't have this pressure of juggling or whatsoever. You just assume that, yeah, for the moment, you still have tenure clock and so on, so it's not that easy to do. But that would be a way to go maybe in the future to increase the value we give to teaching.
Excellent. All right. Thank you all so much. I just want to quickly, we're a minute over time, but I just want to, since Twitter came up a couple times in this discussion, that's exactly the whole point behind this iNetEd website platform, is so we don't have to just be throwing stuff out into the ether in this way anymore. We can come together on this website that's curated for teachers of economics, right? There's this teacher section, so you don't have to worry about your students being like, wait, I thought he did know how to teach that model. You can be like, no, only teachers are going to see this. And then we can have this conversation and share these resources in a more narrowly focused way. But I can't thank you enough. It's Friday night in South Africa. It's Friday night in Paris. I'm sure there are better things to be doing on Friday afternoon in Colombia, but thank you. This was really, really enjoyable and helpful for me. And there's the happy hour now. The button to the lounge is on the AirMeet screen. I'll be there with a big cup of black coffee because the juggling struggle is real. So there's more to be done afterwards, but hope to see you there, and we'll continue the conversation. And thank you all very, very much. And to everybody tuning in, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was really nice.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.